בוקר טוב לכולם.
Good morning, everybody.
אני ציפי ישראלי,
I'm Tzipi Israeli from INSS, and I'm happy to open the first session regarding a Jewish and democratic state and the controversies regarding national security. I'm just waiting for people to be seated.
טוב, תודה רבה.
Thank you.
אוקיי, אז כמו שאמרתי, המושב
As
שלנו
I said,
עוסק במדינה
our
יהודית
session
ודמוקרטית,
deals with the Jewish and democratic state and national security, and it's based on an article written by Pnina and me on strategic evaluation. I can say that the connection a priori derived from some conversations. We were just caring about this issue, and of course later on I'd like to show you a few question marks, and we'd like to deal with them during this session. Our jumping point is this slide, which you can see through the slide, that a great segment of the public is more worried about the social issues than it does from the military ones. And internal cohesiveness is also a component in national strength. So any analysis that deals with national security of Israel and also compels you to look inwards into the society. So just as we do in discussions that have to do with security and politics, we also want through this session to deal also with the other issues. Some of the controversies among the Israeli public has to do with issues that have to do with national security and controversies that we will focus on. The first one is what's the right solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second one is the attitude towards the Arab minority. The third, the attitude to the foreigner and the enemy. And the fourth, the status of religion in the state. The common denominator among these four is the fact that they all are impacted by different perceptions that people have towards values that are the base of this country. Of course, the two values that the state is based on is the fact that it's a Jewish and democratic state. And it's very interesting to look again and again at the scroll of independence, the credo of the state of Israel, and to look at the clear attitude to these components. On the one hand, national and Jewish values, like in the land of Israel, the Jewish people have established their state. On the other hand, if you look at the other side of the democratic and liberal values from its inceptions, the state of Israel also wanted to be liberal. And that you can see the quotations that in the scroll it says that the state will be based on foundations of freedom, justice and peace. There will be complete equality of rights to all the citizens without difference. And also they talk about freedom of religion and conscience. So here we have both. We have religious, we have national, we have democratic and liberal. Actually, we see that the vision of this state was to create a balance among all these values. So we would like to discuss how these democratic values, the liberal and the Jewish values, have an impact, and I will just give you the bullet points that we're going to talk about in this session. The first controversy has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Usually we discuss this issue from the political point of view, but we want to talk about values as well. The rights on this land as opposed to control of another people. How can inequality can promote values? But the other argument is that if you continue to control Palestinians, jeopardizes the rights, and it can undermine Israel and cannot keep it as a democratic state. Or the greater Israel, also with the price of jeopardizing equal rights. That's the price that we have to pay. This is the discussion, and actually we see that every party asks the other party to give up the values they believe in. We are talking about security versus security, values versus values. If the state wants to look ahead, the question is, before we deal with practical issues, I think that the discourse that has to start about the goal of this country. The second controversy has to do about the attitude to the Arab minority, the tension between national values and liberal ones. Some people say that the fact that Israel belongs to the Jews and all its citizens prevents it from being a democratic state by definition. And then we ask, what is the place of the Arab minority? And if I say it, that the core of the controversy is giving preference and priority to the Jews vis-a-vis full rights to the Arab minority. The third controversy was the attitude to the foreigner and the enemy. On the one hand, we see a liberal approach. We're talking about universalism and giving rights to foreigners and looking at a person as a person, and the national approach when we talk about protection to the people who belong to the common nationality, as opposed to giving rights to people from outside. This is an idea that comes from the outside. We're talking about elite people, and the argument is that if they fight for the rights of foreigners or enemies, it's on account of the citizens. So the controversy is that we have to take care of our own people first. The last controversy is the status of religion in this country, and this is of course a controversy which is deep and has to do with the character of the state. What if we talk about national security? We see it in the interface between the religion and the army. Recently we talked about service of women in the IDF, and it's we have to say that we have to prevent from such a discussion because some people are trying to jeopardize the values just because it's convenient. Here too we have two sides that look at two different views. So we have to respect the religious values and the liberal values, and these controversies have to do with the status of various players in the public arena, especially those who are perceived as people who should look at the liberal values. The judicial system, we have to talk about that. How do we create balances and checks among the authorities? And in that we should underscore the fact that this system needs more protection about these liberal values in the reality of today, because it's self-evident in view of the fact that the status of the Supreme Court has been going down recently. Before we begin, just a few points. The first one, a heterogeneous society is an asset. A polarized society is less so. And nevertheless, what we're going to say here, not to blur things, but to talk about cohesiveness. In order to have a real important discussion, we have to underscore the various perceptions, renew the Jewish discussion. This is our first point. And the second point is that we're talking about two legitimate world views. On the one hand, giving up liberal values or democratic values, that can be a right step, but on the other hand, giving up national values can also be dangerous for the state. And that's why we want to discuss in this session this question: how do we balance between national values and liberal ones? So, Pnina, the floor is yours. Thank you, Pnina. We're going to start with the panel itself. We have 5 speakers. Each of them has 7 minutes. I'll be very rigid. And then we'll give another round and have people the possibility to speak for another 3 minutes. Respondents to one another. So let's start with the first speaker, Professor Asher Cohen. He's the head of communication in Bar-Ilan University and the head of the Institute for Zionist Strategy.
Good morning. אני רוצה להכניס לפני
I would like to
שאני אנסה לענות איך מגשרים על
introduce
פני כל
before
הדברים
answering how
האלה.
we bridge all
אני
these
רוצה להציע
matters.
איזושהי חלוקה של
I would
החברה
like to
הישראלית,
suggest
לא
a
בחלוקות הרגילות
certain division
שהן
of
כמובן
Israeli
קיימות.
society,
זה
not according to the
יהודים, ערבים,
traditional divisions
ימין,
which of
שמאל,
course exist,
דתיים,
Jews,
חילונים,
Arabs, right,
מזרחים,
left,
אשכנזים,
religious,
וכל השסעים.
secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and
אלא
all the other
להציג קומה
rifts,
אחת מעל
but to take it one
את
step
המחלוקת
higher, one
שנוגעת
level
לשאלת
higher,
היהודית והדמוקרטית.
regarding the
קודם כל, בוא נתחיל
discussion
מזה
or
שמאחורי יהודית
the
ודמוקרטית,
over
למרות
the
שזה
Jewish and
צמד של
democratic
מילים,
matter. Although this is a pair of
עומדים שלושה
words,
ערכי יסוד.
there are three basic values
אפשר לראות אותם
underlying
כערכי
them.
יסוד, אפשר
They can
לראות
be
אותם
used as basic
כזהויות
values
משנה
or
בתוך הזהות
sub-identities
הכוללת.
within the
ציונות
overall
היא הביטוי הלאומי,
identity. There is
יהדות,
Zionism,
שזה
which is
היחס
the
המסורת
general
הדתית, ודמוקרטית.
identity,
ציונות
Jewish
ויהדות
and
ודמוקרטיה
democratic.
זו התשתית
Zionist,
הערכית
Jewish and democratic, that
והחוקתית של
is
המדינה, מהבחינה
the
הזאת שכך היא התפתחה, זה היה הייעוד שלה,
value
זה מה
infrastructure
שמופיע
of the
במגילת
state. This
העצמאות
was its
בווריאציה כזו או
destiny. This
אחרת,
was what
וזה גם
appears in the
הקונצנזוס
Declaration of
הרחב ביותר
Independence in
שיש
one
לה.
form or another, and that is the broadest
וכאן אני רוצה
consensus we
להגיע
have.
לחלוקה.
And this brings me to the
את
division.
החברה אפשר לחלק
Society can be divided
לחד-ערכיים מול
into
רב-ערכיים.
single value
חד
groups
זהותיים
or
מול
single
רב-זהותיים.
identity groups to multi-identity groups.
החד-ערכיים, עוד מעט
The
נראה
single
שלא תוכל לקום
identity
מפלגה
groups,
של
and we see
החד-ערכיים,
that
כי הם
no
מאוד מנוגדים אחד
party
לשני.
could be
החד-ערכיים יש להם
established
מכנה
on this
משותף אחד.
basis because they're very much
הם
opposed to one
אומרים
another. They have one
שהציונות
statement.
הזאת,
They
באיזושהי
say
וריאציה
that
שאתה לא אומר,
Zionism, whatever
או
variation you
היהדות
take, or Judaism
והדמוקרטיה,
and democracy,
יש ביניהם ניגוד,
there is a
סתירה,
contrast or a
מהותיים, מבניים.
contradiction
זאת
built
תפיסת
in
היסוד, זה
between
המכנה
them.
המשותף
That's their
שלהם.
basic
ובמקום שבו
common
יש
denominator.
סתירה,
And in a place where there
מבנית,
is a
מהותית,
contradiction, an
נדרשת
internal
הכרעה.
basic contradiction,
זאת
you
אומרת,
need to
אנחנו
decide.
בעד הערך
In other words, we
האחד,
are in
כמו שאנחנו
favor
רואים
of
אותו,
one value
ודוחים
as
את
we see
האחרים.
it, and we reject the others.
הנקודה היא
The
שכולם
point
למשל יודעים
is that
להצביע
everyone can
על
point
חד-ערכיים
to
דתיים. ככל
the
שאני הולך יותר
religious
לפינה החרדית,
identity. That if
אז
I
אני
go
מוצא
to
שם
the
את החד-ערכיים
ultra-Orthodox
הדתיים. אין
direction, then I
זהות
see a very
לגיטימית, אלא זהות
clear
היהודית.
single
ואין זהות
identity.
יהודית,
There
הם
is
יגידו
no
לי,
legitimate
אלא
identity
זהות
other than a
במתכונת
Jewish
החרדית
identity,
שלה.
and it must be in its
וכל פעם שזה
ultra-Orthodox
ייתקל באיזושהי
format.
זהות
And
אחרת או
anytime it
בקריאה אחרת,
encounters any
אנחנו
other
צריכים
claim or
לשלול
any
את
other
הזהויות
identity,
האחרות.
we must
אז
negate
את
the other
החד-ערכיות
ones.
הזאת כולנו
So
מכירים.
we're all familiar with that
אלא
approach.
שפחות מדברים
But
על
we talk
החד-ערכיים
less
הדמוקרטיים.
about the democratic
גם
people who
בפינה
take a
הדמוקרטית
similar
יש
view.
חד-ערכיים.
On the
תמיד אני אומר
democratic
שיש
axis, there are
חרדים,
also people who
היינו,
have a
חרדים,
one-sided
כמו שכותבים
view.
רגיל,
They
יש
are
חרדים
also kind of
בגרשיים, שזה ראשי
ultra-Orthodox
תיבות חרדים
in
דמוקרטיים.
in
הם אומרים,
parenthesis. They
לא
are
תיתכן דמוקרטיה,
extreme
אלא אם המדינה
Democrats.
תתפרק
And they say
מיהודיותה
there cannot be
ומציוניותה.
democracy unless
פשוט זה בלתי
the
אפשרי.
state
גם אני רוצה לחדד
completely
פה. זה לא
gets
דמוקרטים
rid of
שאומרים,
its
יש
Jewish and
פגמים
Zionist
בדמוקרטיה, למשל, יותר מדי
character.
דמוקרטיה
They don't
אתנית,
say
וצריך לתקן את
that there
הפגמים.
are
זה עניין
problems or
אחר. אלא
flaws
היא לא
that need
יכולה
to be
להיות
fixed. No,
דמוקרטית
it
כל
cannot
עוד
be
היא יהודית,
democratic as long
כן,
as it is
או
Jewish
ציונית.
or Zionist.
וכמובן שיש חד-ערכיים
And of
בממד
course,
הלאומי,
there
וכל אלה
are
שיגידו לכם,
people with
אין
similar
זכויות
views
למי שאיננו יהודי,
on the
להדיר
national
אותם, להפסיק
axis, people who
זכויות,
say
וכן
that
הלאה, אפשר לראות את זה
people who are not Jews don't
בדעתם.
have any rights and
אלה
so on and so
החד-ערכיים.
forth, or shouldn't
כמובן
have
שהם
any
לא יכולים
rights.
לשתף
Of
פעולה,
course, these people
כי כל
cannot
אחד
cooperate
ממוקד
because each
בערך
is
אחר.
focused on a different single
מולם
value.
עומד הרוב
Facing
הגדול
them
מאוד
are the very, very
של
large
הרב-ערכיים.
majority of the people
וגם
who
הם לא
have
עומדים להקים
multiple
מפלגת
values.
הרב-ערכיים מסיבה פשוטה.
And they're also not going to
שם יש
form a
מריבות על
party
המינון,
for a simple reason,
על
because
השקלול,
there are
על
arguments over
האיזונים.
how
אבל
much
יש להם
and how
מכנה
much to
משותף.
balance what
הם
with
אומרים,
what, but they have a
אכן
common
כן,
denominator. They do say,
ציונות,
indeed,
יהדות
Zionism,
ודמוקרטיה,
Judaism, and democracy,
זו התשתית הערכית
that
והחוקתית
is
של המדינה.
the value
ומדובר ברוב ענק,
infrastructure
אגב,
of the state.
שמנהל
And we're talking about a
מריבות של
huge
קואליציה ואופוזיציה,
majority
מדבר
that
על המינון, על
argue
המינון
and
של
talk
פלורליזם,
about how much
אבל
pluralism and how
יש
much
לו
of this and how much of
מכנה
that, but they
משותף
have
מאוד מאוד
a
ברור.
very, very clear
שלושת
common
ערכי היסוד
denominator.
האלה,
These
שלושת
three
זהויות המשנה
basic
האלה,
identities, sub-identities, and
ממנו,
basic
וכך צריכה
principles are
המדינה
part of it,
להיראות.
and that's how the state
אלא מה?
should look.
כאן אני חייב להתייחס
However,
למשהו.
and here I must relate
יש
to
מקום
one
אחד
thing, there is one
שבו
place
המיעוטים
in which
החד-ערכיים
these
מנצחים
single value
בנוק-אאוט את הרוב
minorities
הענק, אגב,
win
והיציב מאוד
in a
של
knockout
הרב-ערכיים.
the very, very stable and
בשיח
strong
הציבורי
majority of
ובאמצעי
the
התקשורת.
multi-identities, and that's in the
אפשר לעבור
media.
עכשיו, אין זמן לעבור את כל
I
הקבוצות,
can't go through all the
אבל
groups right now,
תמיד
but
חנין זועבי,
Khanin Zouabi,
החד-ערכית בקצה,
who has
זו
a
שחוקרת
single
כל היום
view
את
all the
המדינה
way
היהודית
at the
הדמוקרטית,
extreme, who's
תמיד
always
תזכה
attacking
בכותרות.
Israel's democracy,
הרבה
she'll
יותר
always get the
ממחצית
headlines.
מהציבור
Far
הערבי,
more
שאחרי זה
than
אולי
more than
פרופסור
half of the Arab
יראה לנו,
population, and perhaps
חושב
Professor
מחשבות אחרות.
Smocha will
אבל
show
היא
us,
תזכה
who takes a
בכותרות.
different approach.
וכך יזכו
And
בכותרות
but they'll always
תמיד
get the headlines,
הקצוות, אלה
always the
שיחסמו כבישים בין
extremes, the
החרדים,
ones
ולא אלה
who
שנמצאים
block
בתהליכי
roads,
ישראליזציה
the
וציוניזציה אצל החרדים.
ultra-Orthodox,
משום
and
שזה
not
מוכר
those among them who
בתקשורת,
want
וזה
to
מוכר
become part of
בשיח.
the Israeli
עוד
democracy, but
נקודה
rather the
שצריך לשים אליהם,
extremists. And another point that we need to pay attention to in the new platforms,
וכל הדברים
with
האלה,
Facebook and all the
הקולות
social media,
הקיצוניים מהדהדים
the
הרבה
extremist
יותר, אבל זה לא אומר
voice
שזה מה
reverberate
שקורה
much
בחברה.
stronger, but that doesn't mean that's a
עכשיו, לשאלה
reflection
איך
of what
מגשרים
society
על זה,
really is. So how
הזמן
do we
שלנו
bridge
תם,
that, because our time is short,
ואיך הרב-ערכיות
and how does the
מחזיקה את עצמה.
multivariance
אני מציע להסתכל
identity
בהקשר של דת
sustain
ומדינה,
itself?
אני לא רוצה דוגמאות אחרות,
I
על אמנת
suggest that we
גביזון-מדן.
look at the Gavizon
נושא
Meidan
השבת,
covenant.
שנמצא עכשיו
Look at the
על
subject
סדר
of
היום כבר
Shabbat, which has
כמעט
been
כל
on our
הזמן.
agenda. It's almost always on our agenda.
הנה, יכולים
Here we see
שני אנשים
that two
רב-ערכיים,
people who have
אחת
multiple
מהאגף
values,
החילוני,
one from
הציוני,
the
אפשר לומר
Zionist,
אפילו השמאלי
secular,
במידה
we could say
מסוימת,
leftist
ואחד מהאגף הציוני, דתי,
wing,
הימני,
and
הרב
one
יעקב
from
מדן,
the religious right
ומציעים
wing,
לפנינו אמנה של
Rabbi
300
Meidan
עמודים.
and
הנה,
Ruth
זה מה
Gavizon
שאפשר
from the
לעשות
left,
בתחום
and
כל
they
יחסי
came
דת
up
ומדינה.
with a
קודם כל
covenant
נושא
on
השבת.
all the subject
בילוי,
of
תרבות וספורט
religion
יהיה
and state,
פתוח,
on the subject
מסחר ותעשייה יהיה סגור.
entertainment,
זה לא אומר
sports,
שזה
and
טוב,
so on
לא
will
טוב,
be open,
אבל
and
אפשר להגיע
restaurants,
לזה.
but businesses will be
וכיוון
closed. I'm not saying
שזמני
that's the
תם,
only way, but it can be
אני אסיים
something that
בחוזק
is
חומרים.
doable. My time is up, so I would like
המדינה
to
הזאת,
emphasize something
בניגוד
else. This state,
בניסוח של השאלה, איך אפשר
unlike
לגשר?
in the wording of the question, how to
כאילו יש כל
bridge,
הזמן סתירה וכל
it
הזמן
seems
צריך
that there's
לגשר.
always a
המדינה
contradiction and we
הזאת,
need
אם
to
היא לא
bridge.
תהיה
That's not the
יהודית,
case.
היא
This
לא תהיה
state, if it
דמוקרטית.
is not Jewish, it will
כל
not be
המשמעות היא נהייתה
democratic.
דמוקרטית בגלל שהיא
It
יהודית,
became
והיא לא משהו
democratic
אחר כמו
because it
בסביבה
was
שהיא חיה.
Jewish.
ואני אסיים בחוזק חומרים. אם האוכלוסיות
And
יתחילו לנוע על
if
הפינות
the
החד-ערכיות,
population start
בין אם
going
בין
into
אם
those
דמוקרטיות, בין אם לאומניות, בין אם
single-hued
דתיות,
corners, whether it's
והאמצע
democratic,
יהיה
Jewish, or
תעשו ככה
nationalist,
לחומר, הוא יסדק,
and
הוא
the
יישבר.
material
אבל
will
אם
crack and break.
המסה הגדולה של
But if the
האוכלוסייה כמו
large
היום
mass of the
תישאר
population,
באמצע,
like today,
הרב-ערכי,
remains
אז
in the
יש פינות, זה
center with
בסדר, אנחנו נכיל
multiple
אותם.
views,
תעשו
that's
ככה
okay.
לחומר,
We'll
הוא לא
be able
יסדק
to contain
והוא לא
it,
יישבר.
and then
תודה רבה.
nothing will break or crack. Thank you.
תודה רבה. אז פרופסור אשר כהן נתן לנו
Professor
את
Asher Cohen
השאלה,
gave
הסקירה הכללית,
us a general overview of how to bridge the different identities, perhaps not to bridge, how they can actually be on the same side. The next speaker, Professor Sami Samocha, who is a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Haifa and a laureate of the Israel Prize. And we ask the same question, how do we bridge between the fact of Israel being a Jewish state and properly addressing the Arab population? I apologize that I am hoarse, so I can only read my remarks. That's the only way I can tell. The nature of the state and the conflict between it and the Palestinians are two built-in barriers to normalizing relations between the Jewish majority and Arab minority. Regarding the first barrier, the paradigm of a Jewish and democratic state as it exists does not address the needs of the Arab minority and constantly creates a sense of alienation among them. We can come up with other formulas for a Jewish and democratic state which would better address the needs of the Arab minority. I will present one which is more satisfactory, and I will relate to the three meanings of a Jewish democratic state: the meaning of a Jewish state, the meaning of a democratic state, and the meaning of a Jewish and democratic state. We'll start with the Jewish state. The current formula of a Jewish state is that Israel is the state of the Jewish people alone. That is a formulation that is based on exclusion. And instead, Israel could be defined as the state of the Jewish people and of all its citizens. That is a formula that Benny Begin of the Likud and people of Meretz suggested. What's wrong with that idea that Israel Israel is the joint homeland of Jews and Arabs. And what's wrong with the conception of a joint society and an educational system that is based on this approach? The alternative formulation does away with the exclusive ownership of Jews over the state and recognizes the Arabs as part of it. This formulation does not turn Israel into a binational state, because the law of return will continue to exist and the Jewish majority is assured in the state. It will clearly signal to all its citizens that the state must serve not only its Jewish citizens but its Arab citizens as well. Israel as a joint society can apply citizenship as a joint identity for Jews and Arabs and thereby achieve greater solidarity and acceptance. The more serious problem is not a Jewish state, it is a democratic state. The Israeli democracy is the main factor that explains why the Arab minority observes the law and is not part of the opposition strategy of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Therefore, it is vital to foster democracy if we wish to maintain peace and quiet and stability inside the Green Line. Democracy in Israel is procedural and not essential. It is a system of procedures and institutions that work according to the rule of the majority, whereas an essential democracy also advances the basic values of human dignity, equality, justice, freedom, and fairness. Principles that restrict the rule of the majority and prevent a deterioration of a tyranny of the majority. Israel does not have a constitution. It has been in a state of emergency since it was established, which makes it easy to undermine civil rights and human rights. In Israel, the protection of minority rights are flawed, and everyone suffers from that, but especially the Arab minority. The weakness, as opposed to the weakness of its democracy, Israel's Jewish character is very strong, because Israel is not only a Jewish state, it is also a Zionist state, which gives the state the role of preserving its character. We could strengthen Israel's democracy in many ways, and here are a number of steps. We can do away with the emergency situation to replace the British defense ordinances, the draconian ordinances, with more liberal Israeli ordinances. Arabs can be given national rights in addition to the cultural and ethnic rights that they are currently given. National rights would include recognition of the Arabs as a national minority with a Palestinian identity, with a clear affinity to the Palestinian nation, educational and cultural autonomy, participation in the government, and entry of Arab parties into the government coalitions, giving them a right to parts of the budget according to their proportion in the population, division of lands based on needs and not by nationality, the requirement to consult with the Arab leadership regarding those laws that affect them, the establishment of Arab towns, and Jewish Arab mixed towns. I see that my time is almost up. We can do away with those parts of the law that forbid the establishment of a party that denies the right of Israel to be a Jewish state. A defensive democracy doesn't need that law. We don't need to forbid those kinds of associations. Other changes is full civil, making the national service completely a civilian service. And regarding a Jewish and democratic state, there is no balance between Jewish and democratic. The current formulation is based on a built-in conflict between the Jewish and democratic aspects. What needs to be done is not to strengthen the Jewish character of the state, but rather to strengthen the democratic character of the state in order to balance those two things a little better. In Israel, there was a process of democratization which has continued almost up to the present. It has been stopped by the right-wing government since 2009, and the situation, we are on a slippery slope of a majority rule that could become the tyranny of the majority. And that could lead to a severe conflict between Jews and Arabs in Israel, and could violate the peace and quiet that we have enjoyed until now. Thank you.
We see already that there's no agreement among the speakers. So we're talking about harmony and respecting oppositions. We'll go to another aspect, and that is the issue of the attitude to the foreigner, to the enemy, and the values of fighting, purity of arms. We also wrote it in our article. We remind you of an article that talks about the commanders from Venus and the soldiers from Mars. And we're talking about the Elor Azalia, the soldier who shot the Palestinians. How much do you have to protect an enemy? And that the senior commanders of the army try to work according to value, but then they don't do justice with their soldiers. We want to address the Brigadier General Onofsky, and the question to you will be, how do we maintain the values of fighting while giving support to the soldiers and winning the battle vis-à-vis the enemy? Good morning. Had I had to answer with one sentence, there was a headline at the time, allow the IDF to win. What does it mean? Allow the IDF to manage its business, to do its missions, how they can determine by themselves. And now I think that the question is rather complicated. It's made up of three issues, values, support, and prevailing. And the main problem is that everybody here in the audience, when you talk about values of the IDF, everybody interprets it in a different way. Everybody interprets support and winning in a different way. So when you talk about values in the IDF, there's something that's called the spirit of the army, and I think that the great success is that we can talk about the spirit of the values of the IDF, and I think everybody can connect to that. But really, if we take the Lior al-Azaria case with the soldier who shot the Palestinians, we'll find in all sorts of populations of people who are here that they will ask, one will say that it cannot be that we enable somebody to shoot very bad injured terrorist who is not a threat. And there'll be other people that think that the values of the IDF, so that a terrorist, by definition, we have to kill. And we saw what happened in this country politically and socially, and also in the army with this Elor Azaria case. So when we talk about maintaining values, everybody has different values in their head. And in this context, I say that we have to talk about the spirit of the IDF. That's focused enough and good enough. And we're talking about purity of arms. And if you, in purity of arms, you understand exactly what this soldier had to do. As for support or giving back tailwind, I think here the answer is simple. Although there are some people that will say that you have to give support or to give backing no matter what, and I think that backing is very important in order to enable the commanders and the soldiers to do their missions, their various missions without fear, with a lot of courage. And they'll know that they're going to get support from their commanders. However, you can give tailwind to mistakes, but you cannot give support for crimes. Therefore, I think this is basic. If you made a mistake without intention, we have to give you backing, and usually we find it difficult to do. We can't just give support for anything. But on the other hand, if you did something which is a crime, sexual harassment, or just shooting without any purpose, if you are under the influence, whatever, you can take anything. If you make a mistake, it's not a mistake and you're a criminal. So the IDF has to differentiate between mistakes and crimes, and these are difficult decisions, but on the other hand, not to back, also support crimes. As prevailing or winning, when I was recruited, they spoke about decisiveness. All of a sudden, the last few years, we have this concept of winning. Why did it happen to us? Because we got into a much more complicated fighting. We're not sure we want to win. If we fight the Hamas, we don't want to make it collapse. We want to keep it, preserve it. So in the past, when we talked about winning, of course, we talked about complete decisiveness, about deterrence, about winning, whatever, in addition to protection and defense. That was in the last decade. Now you hear the concept of winning. And I asked her, did we win the Second Lebanon War? Some people will say yes. Others, again, it's interpretation. Therefore, if we talk about values, backing, and winning, we have to know how to do it. We want to win, but it's given to interpretations. But the basic question is, what should we do in order to preserve the IDF as strong and winning? So I thought about real values, allow the IDF to do their jobs according to their spirit. The second thing is allow the IDF to be independent, that the political echelons will tell the IDF what it expects, what missions they have to do, and allow the IDF the how to do it. They are responsible for directives, for commands. The IDF will have its own court-martial, its investigations it will do within the army. Allow the IDF to have its independence, so that they will get to all the populations. And the last thing that I think that the IDF should know is to remain the army of the people, and that's the most complicated. Let me talk about that for a second. To be the army of the people, it means that the army belongs to everybody. Arabs, religious, secular, Jews, anybody. And in order to be the army of everybody, first of all, you have to recruit the people. How many are enlisted today? Less than 50% of our youngsters. How do we preserve and to still be the army of the people when only 50% are recruited? So they try to enlist as much as possible from the Haredi, from the ultra-Orthodox, from Arabs, from Jews, everybody. They're trying to enlist everybody these days. And the second thing is they enable everybody to feel comfortable in the army. Namely, each soldier will act according to the commands, of course, and the spirit. But if I came in an ultra-Orthodox Jew, I go out the same way. If I came out in secular, I come out as secular. No matter how I came in, I can keep and maintain my identity and the IDF. Some people don't accept it, but we have Haredi regiments, and we have, so every population can feel comfortable in the IDF. And finally, we have to preserve the trust of the people. You know the slogan, the trust of the people, it demands from the IDF to be transparent. It requires it to be open to do whatever it can to put it on the table. That requires a discourse with the public. I think this chief of staff really invests in it. And he understands that in order to realize his missions, he needs the support of the public of 80–90%, and that's very important to preserve. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we related to the values, and that discourse about values regarding the national issue vis-à-vis the democratic and liberal also infiltrates into discussions within the army. Another arena where this discussion about these values is underscored, especially recently, is the Supreme Court, which became some sort of an arena for struggle and criticism. The next speaker, Professor Daniel Friedman from the Tel Aviv University. He's the Israel Prize Laureate, and he was also the Minister of Justice up to 2009. Professor Friedman, the question to you is, what should be the right scope of judicial criticism and the balance between democratic and national values?
Good morning, one and all. The question I had been asked has to do with the place of the court in the balance between these values. But you must remember that the court is only one factor of the system, and it is the choice between national and democratic values, and that is what the entire system has to do, this choice, including the government, the Knesset. If we look at the question, how do we cope with the infiltrators, then the court has its part to play, but it's only one factor within the system. It is not the maximal or only one, although it is certainly an important factor. So that is one point to make. The second point is that this problem is in a certain way international. We find it in Australia, in the UK, in the US, in other places. It is not unique to Israel. However, there is one element or several elements that are actually unique to Israel, and that is in terms of the level of threats this country is facing. I think that the level of threats to Israel is higher than when we talk about other countries, most other countries around the world. In fact, Israel, I think, is the only country that has powerful neighbors that are striving to annihilate it. There's no other country in the world that is in such a similar situation. And the only other remark I will make before I go into the question, that is, what are our national values? That's also controversial. If we look at Israel as the Jewish people's state, then the question is, who are the Jews? Who is a Jewish person? And the very simple example is the dispute between the Reform and the Orthodox Jews. If a person has undergone Reform conversion, is that person a Jew, or do they need to also undergo Orthodox conversion? There is an inner dispute that is very poignant, and the question is, what are our national values? So now I will try to present a sort of snapshot of the court's position over the years in the time I have left. Well, I would divide this period of time from the establishment of the State of Israel to date to three stages. The first stage, I would say, were the first 35 years, during which the court had emphasized very strongly liberalism, recognizing the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, human rights, the Kol Ha'am verdict, and it was also sensitive to national questions. For instance, an issue had arisen about perhaps banning a film that had to do with enticement and perhaps would bring about violence. The film adopts an argument whereby Arab organizations and state enemies' arguments are distributed, and the court did indeed ban the film. And another example, which is perhaps even more important, is the question of whether the people who are part of the Al-Ard group, can they actually partake in elections? And in its verdict, the court said no, and based itself on the experience in Germany and the Weimar regime, saying that the positions of the Al-Ard group and finding a just solution to the Palestinian problem, while seeing it indivisible according to the Palestinian Arab public. And the court had actually assumed that this does not correlate with the values of the State of Israel, and therefore it did not allow them to participate in the elections. The second stage began after the first judicial revolution around the 1980s, early 1980s, 1980s, and I would say pretty much up until 2011 or 12. During that stage, we see a complete turnaround. The court adopts a completely different approach, and I think that it has a very harsh outlook on what we call values, not only democratic values, but liberal values. That doesn't always go hand in hand. And if I had given an example of banning a movie, then the opposite outcome is that the previous verdict had been overturned, and then we saw a new verdict. And if I gave you an example, a very important example, whereby the National Palestinian Movement was not allowed to express itself in Israeli parliament, that too changed in a verdict issued in the early 1980s. The court allowed Kahana's movement, Kach, which was racist. And here you can ask whether it was liberal or not. On the one hand, we even allow an extreme person such as Kahana to take part and be a candidate. That's very liberal. But on the other hand, when we talk about a racist movement, perhaps it is not so liberal after all, because it actually is detrimental to the conditions, to the status of other populations. And so the definition of liberalism and what and whether radical liberalism is in fact liberalism at all is an open question. However, at the same time, we did allow, or the court did give the possibility, it actually overturned the previous verdict and allowed the National Palestinian Movement some representation in Israeli parliament. And we have also come to the point where Azmi Bishara was represented in the parliament despite his very harsh statements. And the question is, what are the repercussions of such representation on the attitude of the Arab sector to the State of Israel and the Jewish sector's tendency and its impact on the Arab sector? We are currently at somewhat of a third stage, I would say, that we have witnessed since 2012 or so, where the court's line is somewhere in between these two extremities. I would say that it is extremely sensitive and considerate of the national aspect, but we have not reached a similar situation than we had in the past. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was certainly just the tip of the iceberg, and perhaps we'll get back to that a little later on during the discussion. Our final speaker before the responders is Ms. Polly Bronstein, the founder of Darkeinu, and also the former CEO of Kol Echad, One Voice. And I would like to hear from you, please. What do you think? How do you think we can move from a discourse of extremities to a discourse on competing values, maybe a little bit about left and right wing in Israeli society? Thank you very much and good morning. A few years ago, I crossed the Chizme checkpoint for the first time, and I took the road to Ramallah and Beit El and Ofra, and I had a spiritual experience. I was on that road and I didn't expect to feel like I belonged to this landscape. I certainly felt a true connection. And as I was feeling this and experiencing this on my way to Ramallah, a European peace activist was sitting in the passenger seat, and I happened to say, "This is the most beautiful place in Israel." And I said that in English. And he looked at me and he said, "Polly, this isn't Israel." And I said, "Look, I don't expect you to understand, but certainly this is Israel. This is the land of the Bible. This is where our history took place, and I'm telling you that I feel it in my DNA." And he looked at me and he couldn't understand how a person he knows is very active in pursuing the two-state solution and yet has such feelings of nostalgia about Greater Israel. And I said, "Don't misunderstand me. I think this entire area belongs to us, and I feel the connection to this place, but it is impractical for Israel to be here. In Judea and Samaria, there are 2.5 million Palestinians, and I'm willing to give this area up so that the Palestinians can set up a state alongside Israel, so that Israel can remain democratic and Jewish." Jewish. I am pragmatic. That is my ideology. Now, I didn't invent pragmatism. Pragmatism is embedded within the Zionist movement. I was inspired by the partition plan when we were offered by the UN to have a smaller state, but in Israel, to set up the Jewish state in Israel. We agreed, unlike our partners, the Arabs, who rejected this offer. We agreed to compromise, and even though pragmatism is embedded within who we are and within the Zionist movement, we are still finding ourselves being in the extreme. Either we are our tribe, my group, which will make Israel the way it is, or we'll lose everything. Either we're going to have a liberal state, or we're going to lose it and it's going to be a fascist state. Either we have a division between religion and state, or we have a halacha state, a Jewish law state. And I'm going to tell you another short story. Last year, my daughter was 12 years old, and we were invited to her school in Tel Aviv to have an evening for all the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah children. And it was a wonderful school, a wonderful evening, and we sat there, her parents, and we watched the show. And the peak of the show was the parent representative's speech, who explained to the children how to have this sort of ritual, this rite of passage among the Indians, the Eskimos, and we waited, and the speech was over, and we forgot to say how Judaism actually notes this rite of passage and this transition. And how is it that in this school, not once in the evening did they talk about Judaism and taking up the observation of mitzvahs upon you? And we said, how come this is happening? And then they told us in the school, well, we used to talk about it in the past, but the parents were so angry and it went into this whole religionization campaign, so now we steer clear of it. And so let's wrap up the first story for a moment from Judea and Samaria and get back to the story that I just told you about the school, in my daughter's school. If I were to hold a referendum in my daughter's school today, you'll get a vast majority in favor of the two-state solution. I have no doubt about that. But if we dig deeper and ask them, why two states? Why not a binational state? Why not one single state between the Jordan and the sea? We want two states because we believe we should have two states for two nations, one state being the nation state of the Palestinians and the other being the nation state of the Jewish people. And if it is the Jewish people's nation state, what sort of content do we put into the Judaism of this state, and what does it mean? The way we raise our children, we should decide, we should choose and discuss this issue. I think that we do not appreciate pragmatism and moderation enough. We don't treat it as a positive value. When we look at our leaders, and often we commend them for standing their ground, for not being willing to compromise, for what we are fighting for, and we don't appreciate the same leader, the same group who are willing to say, we are not only, we as a group, don't only ask ourselves what sort of footprint am I leaving behind, what of my values and ideology do I want in Israel, but I'm also asking, where am I willing to compromise? You asked before about the Medan-Gabizon Treaty. Well, where do I, in my Shabbat, in my Saturday, where am I willing to compromise in order for us all to be able to live together? And here we need to say that no one is going anywhere. The ultra-Orthodox are staying, and the Arabs are staying, and the religious Zionists are staying, and the traditionals are staying, and the people of Tel Aviv are staying. We're all here to stay, but we also all want to win. We want our state to reflect us, our set of values. But in order for us all to be able to contribute somewhat to their country and to its character and to its future, we must assume that others will also leave their own footprint. And I would like to end with a suggestion. We are again on the verge of the nation law turbulence, and it's a wonderful thing when, since we decide to legislate it, it must be legislated with a broad consensus. And I heard people saying that the problem with Israel is that the majority thinks they're a minority and the minority thinks it's a majority. We're sitting around the table, Arabs and Jews, at the Knesset, and we're holding a true discussion about what a nation would look like, or a country would look like, with a nation that has a majority, what kind of responsibility it has vis-a-vis the minority, and what does the minority do realizing it's a minority. So I'd like to call upon the coalition members, if we're going to legislate this law, if we're going to put Israel's character and nature as a state in law, let us try to legislate this law not in a sort of in a storm, do it in all sorts of strange ways, but let's do it properly. Let's strive to legislate a law that will actually reflect this Jewish democratic state, because this mission has not been completed. The Zionist movement has not realized its full potential yet. We still have to ensure that we have a thriving Jewish and democratic state with defensible borders for generations to come. Let's start with the nation law. Thank you very much, Polly. And now let's go to the respondents, please, who are all researchers in the Institute. The first will be Mr. Khader Swed.
Good morning. If I may, I'd like to relate to the tension between a Jewish state as opposed to equal rights. It's almost 7 decades now that the Arab citizens of Israel live in a dual marginality. I think, Professor Smocha, that's a term that you coined. This dual marginality has become stronger since the Six-Day War, and even more so since the Oslo Agreement, which left the Israeli Arabs outside of any settlement, didn't give them any voice at all. I understand, and to a certain extent agree with the fact that they are not part of the solution, but that's a different opinion. What have the Arab citizens of Israel done since the establishment of the state? Both the bent-over generation and the erect generation and the challenging generation that arose in the late 80s and early 90s and which is now active in the 2000s. As the headings of a series of your studies, Professor Smocha, they're not breaking the rules of the game with the Israeli establishment on the one hand, and you described that very nicely, and I agree with you very much. But they're not breaking, they're continuing to play by the rules with those on the other side of the Green Line. They're maintaining strong and good relations with the Palestinian side in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I am concerned by the extremist trend we're seeing in the area where I live and in other places as well. This extremism among the younger generation, if until now we said that the current generation, the current leadership is a generation that challenges the state, after previously there were generations that were less challenging towards the state. Today we have a generation that is open to the world, to global trends, and that generation is challenging the collective identity and is challenging the consensus of identity. I am concerned with a situation where there will be a weakening or a halting of the Israelization process among the Israeli Arabs and a growing strengthening of the Palestinianization on their part, not of nationalism, but of beyond that to ultranationalism. Professor Smocha asked a very important question: how to bridge between the democratic and Jewish characters of the state. My question, with which I will conclude: how can we bridge between our civil identity and the national identity? As a father and an educator, I do it with my children and with my students in school. But my question is, how do you do it on the level of the collective of the Arab-Israeli minority?
תודה רבה. עכשיו דוקטור כרמית פדן.
בוקר טוב.
I would like to dialogue with what Hagi Topolansky said. I would claim that values or working according to codes doesn't benefit the state only on the moral level, but also on the practical level and on the operational level regarding the internal military order, because in a situation where different factors within the army and outside the army threaten the internal organization of the army, for example, by threatening the values that are guiding the actions of the army, that are guiding the actions of the soldiers and the commanders, that means that they are posing a threat to the internal military order, and they are threatening the order in the expanse, which is the role of the army, between neutralizing the threats and ensuring security. You mentioned Hebron and the matter of the soldier that shot the terrorist, and that is an example of what I want to talk about today, because in that situation we could see a situation in which factors from outside the army intervened and were telling soldiers how they were supposed to act in that situation, and these were things that ran counter to the norms and orders of the army. We're talking about the rules of engagement in this case, that forbid the shooting of someone who's been neutralized. The moment the army knows how to distance those factors from the army, as well as those inside the army, to influence soldiers and commanders by creating an alternative to the principles and values of the army, which will continue to be a guiding light to soldiers and commanders. It's important to mention that the judgment of the military action in light of these values will not create a clash, and they will be backed up as soon as they act according to the values of the IDF. And in that way, a victory over the enemy, this is a challenge that is posed to the IDF and its commanders, and it requires that the IDF stand firm against those people who try to intervene from the outside in professional terms, and it's important to act against this. I would like to further add that where we, in the connection of the People's Army, in what Hagi mentioned, the main question that faces the army is how it can integrate and include a wide variety of groups in the population when there are certain groups that exert pressure on the army, when the IDF identifies itself as the official People's Army or the government's People's Army, as the Chief of Staff Eisenkot described it yesterday, while maintaining order. Thank you. And now we'll hear from Kim Lavi.
Good morning. I'd like to talk about what Professor Asher Cohen said when he talked about the one-hued and multi-hued and the combat between and the struggle between them. I'd like to ask you, what is the point of multi-valuesism when if we take one of these components, let's say the democratic one, and weakens it to the point that it remains in its most minimal level? Or let's say it this way, what's the point of democracy if we can't control it? And I think this is today one of the most meaningful discussions we see in the political arena. And I think that if we at the end of the day remain with three components, one of which has no meaning, then you've actually found some decisiveness. Those who have multi-values also look for decisiveness rather than an attempt for balances and a shared life. I also want to talk about the disagreement about the solution of the Palestinian issue. I think it hasn't come up enough. I think this is the theater where the most substantial struggle over liberal and democratic values is being held, since these days in our political government, we're all living in the same world, we're all in a very similar political context. At the core of our political government are people who are trying to lead a certain ideology, which is Greater Israel, and it is in collision with democracy, both in terms of the law does not allow it to do it, and also in terms of substance, the liberal values that we're trying to promote. And as you said before, this ideology, its implications is a lack of human rights, and we see it when it comes to cope with the court. Whether it's the academic world, whether it's the media, whether it's the world of arts, these are areas where freedom of expression still remains, and also the ability to go against the government and what they say. And this is also at the heart of the political arena, because that is why it also feeds the weakening of democratic and liberal values, as you've also described in your document and tried to show. I also think that we see here a struggle between values, national democratic values. I think it's an unfair competition, because the national Jewish identity we have is inherent. There is no question about our national Jewish identity here in the State of Israel. The question of the regime, whether we're a democratic regime, and what is this democratic regime, I think that is the main question, and that's not a value, that's not an inherent identity, that is an ethos that we all choose to be a part of. And I think that if today there is a component that is threatened, it's not Israel's Jewish identity, it's essential democratic identity. Thank you very much. And now Dr. Kobi Michael. Thank you. Good morning. 4 very short comments. The first has to do with the way the first question was worded, and that is the tension between historical rights and controlling another nation. That creates an analytical and methodological space that does not reflect the dilemma in which most of Israeli society is in. I think that the majority of Jewish society, at least in Israel, does not cope with these two issues, but rather whether we can or cannot reach an agreement, and if we can, what kind of agreement will it be? And I think that one of the most important questions are in this realm, and this dichotomous wording is perhaps standing in our way and not allowing us to see things as they are. The second remark has to do with the tension between respecting religious values and pluralism. I don't think this tension exists. Here again, the question and the way it was worded represents extremities. I think that we can respect religious values and be a pluralist at the same time. The problem is with the extremes approaches who only represent small groups in society who are at the ends of the spectrum. If you look at Ashdod, that is a very interesting example of the connection between a society that is traditional and respects religious values, but at the same time also respects the matter of the Shabbat, or how it is defined according to a pluralist filter or prism. The third remark has to do with this sort of link between democratic and liberal. We all know where it came from, but this link between democratic and liberal actually creates an identity or identification between a liberal camp and the democratic, and actually takes the other camp allegedly out of this belonging or out of the ability to be democratic. So there can be conservatives who are also democratic, and I think that should be somehow moderated, because liberal and democratic is not the same thing. And the fourth comment has to do with the values of the IDF. I think it would be a grave error to stick to this matter of allowing the army to run its own affairs as it deems fit, also on the value aspect. We have a responsibility as civic supervisors, because values are a code for how force is used, and how force is used, military force at that, is a kind of responsibility that the government has, and where the government does not view itself as responsible and as a backing for the army that way, then we come face to face with a reality whereby the IDF finds itself alone in a place where there is a collision between such values. Thank you. And now we'd like to move on to a round where we can actually respond to one another. But first, I think that Professor Asher Cohen talked a little bit about the role played by the media in honing, because what came up with what Komi said is that most of us are somewhere in the middle. But somehow the discourse is only given, or we only hear in the discourse, we only hear the extremities, and that is maybe part of the problem with the media, with these various networks. And I'd like Tzipi to talk about that. Okay, well, a similar discussion to what we saw about the Supreme Court we also have with the media in the last 2 years or so. A lot of criticism has been directed at the media from many directions, and some say that its status as a free media has been weakened, and on the other hand, we have other expressions such as the media being very left-wing, and all sorts of variations. And I'd like to turn your attention to the position of the media. Its position has changed compared to what it was in the 1990s, and we have to see that it has expanded in terms of its quantity. Now we hear a wider range of more diversity. We have Makor Rishon, we have Channel 20, we have Israel Hayom, but we have also other channels than we've had in the past. And also among these means of the media, we see more and more people who are identified with a conservative center-right. And so in the era of social media, the ability to be exposed, and I'm saying only allegedly or only ostensibly is better. But why is it only ostensible? Because this diverse discourse leads to a change in discourse, and I think we all read ourselves. We know that it also comes up in studies that media consumers only want to hear confirmation of their own opinions rather than contradicting information, and therefore that creates the situation whereby every group, every tribe has its own media. And the question today is, how do we reach an audience that is not your own? How can we actually challenge our own positions and opinions? And as for what Asher said about the discourse of the extremes, we know this discourse of extremes, and we mostly find it in the social media. But here again, we must remember that this discourse of extremes in Israeli society is also within a national framework. We have to mark the borders and boundaries of the democratic state, and the messages usually are within this local framework. We don't see discourse so much, and I'm talking about values that are perhaps liberal on one hand, or on the other hand, the other way. It mostly represents center positions, certainly in defense-related matters, but that's for another time. And at the end of the day, I think that we will have some sort of agreement on a strong and independent media, just like we talk about the Supreme Court, which is a social institute that is very much needed, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Thank you very much.
אני חושבת שמה שראינו
I
פה,
think that what we
ובאמת
saw
אחת התחושות
here,
בכלל בציבור הישראלי, זה
one of
איזשהו
the feelings
חשש,
among the public, there's a
אמרה את זה,
fear
הלאומי והיהודי הם
about this
חזקים
national
כרגע,
Jewish
אבל
issues are very
תחושה
strong
של
now, but there's a
חלקים נכבדים
feeling
בציבור של כרסום
in the public of
בנושא הדמוקרטי,
gnawing
ואולי לאו
into
דווקא
the
כליברליזם,
democracy.
אלא
Not as
הדמוקרטיה המהותית.
liberalism, but real
שהתייחס אליה גם
democracy
פרופסור סמוחה.
that is jeopardized today.
ותחושה נוספת
And another
שכדי
sense,
לאפשר
in order
את
to
השקילה
enable
הזאת,
this
שחלק מהרציונל שלה הוא גם
feeling
כדי
that part of the
לאפשר
rationale
אולי
is in
ארץ
order to
שלמה, עכשיו
enable
להתקשר גם לנושא הזה וגם קידום של
the promotion
מקום מרכזי לדת,
of
אז
a
זה מתחבר גם
central place for the
להיבט הזה,
religion.
כדי לאפשר את
In
הדברים
order to
האלה
enable
צריך
these things,
גם בעצם לוותר
you
על
also have to
ערכים
give up
דמוקרטיים במובן המהותי
democratic
של
values
דמוקרטיה,
in the
וגם
real
לשחוק
essence of democracy, and
מעמדם של
also
שומרי
to
הסף,
erode
כמו
the
בית המשפט
status
העליון או
of the
התקשורת, כדי
gatekeepers
לאפשר
like
את
the
זה.
Supreme Court
וזה,
or the
אם אני
media.
קושרת ביחד
And
את
this I
המרכיבים
connect
השונים,
together
אז אני
all
מאוד
these
אשמח
components. I'll
להתייחסות
be
שלכם.
very happy if you can just
קודם כל לפרופסור
respond,
אשר
first of all,
כהן,
Professor
לחשש
Asher
הזה.
Cohen, to this fear among the public.
טוב.
Well,
אם תלחצו,
if
אם
you
תחפשו ברשת
look at the
ותכתבו
media
הדמוקרטיה
and you
בסכנה או
write
הדמוקרטיה
democracy in
מידרדרת,
danger
תקבלו מאות או
or
אלפי
democracy
תוצאות.
collapsing, you'll get thousands of
תכתבו הדמוקרטיה
responses.
משתפרת,
If you say
תקבלו מעט
democracy
תוצאות, אני
is
כבר אומר לכם,
improving,
אחת
you'll
מהם
get
שלי.
very few results,
אני
and
אומר
one
את
of
זה?
them is mine. And why?
משום שגם פרופסור סמוחה אמר
Because
פה,
Professor
יש פה
Smocha said the
הידרדרות,
same.
מאז
There's
כמובן
a
שלטון הימין
decline
הבריטי,
since
שמנחם
the
מאוטנר כתב במאמר
regime of
נפלא
the right.
מ-2009,
There was a
סליחה.
wonderful
האמת היא
article
שמאוטנר, כן, כתב,
by
שכבר
Mautner.
בשנות
He
ה-80
wrote
זה שנות
that even in the
החרדה,
80s already
הפשיזם
were the
וכל
years
הדברים
of
האלה וכן הלאה. אני
anxiety,
רוצה להגיד פה
fascism, and
משהו.
all that.
יש כאן נטייה
But
לתאר
there's a
ויכוחים
tendency
פנים-דמוקרטיים
to describe internal
לגיטימיים
democratic
כוויכוח בין
discussion
דמוקרטים
as
ללא
a
דמוקרטים.
discussion
אחד
between
מהם,
Democrats and
פרופסור
non-Democrats.
למשל לגבי
One
האקטיביזם.
is
אתה נגד
activism. What? You're
כן?
against
זה לא
activism?
דמוקרטי, זה
You're
לא
not
ויכוח
democratic.
פנים-דמוקרטי,
It's
איך
not
ראוי
an
לבית המשפט
internal
השופט,
proper
אלא מה? אז קודם כל יש נטייה
discussion.
כזאת,
So there's
ואני
such
מציע
a
להסתכל על
tendency, and
מדדי
I
הדמוקרטיה,
suggest we
שאגב,
should look
לאחרונה באמת
at
קצת ירדו,
the
אבל
indices
9
of
שנים מתנהל
democracy
פה
that
שיח,
went down. But for 9
הדמוקרטיה
years,
בסכנה והיא
we have a
מידרדרת. יש רק
discourse that
בעיה אחת.
democracy is in
יכול להיות שהיא
danger,
מידרדרת,
in jeopardy.
אבל
It's
מדעי החברה לא
declining. Maybe
מצליחים
it's
למדוד את זה.
declining, but the
לא
social
הדמוקרטי אינדקס של האקונומיסט, ולא
science
Freedom
doesn't
House, וגם לא
manage
מדד
to
הדמוקרטיה
measure it.
הישראלי.
Not
לא
in the
הצליחו
Israeli.
למדוד את זה.
Nobody
כנראה
managed to
שאנחנו
measure
מוגבלים
it.
מבחינה מתודולוגית.
Apparently, we're
הדמוקרטיה
limited
פה
from
לא
a
הידרדרה
methodological
כמו
point of view. The
שהידרדרה,
democracy did not
בשיח.
decline.
ואני
I
רוצה להגיד
like
משהו
people talk
לגבי
about
הנושא
it.
של ארץ ישראל,
And
שלמה
as
מול
for the
דמוקרטיה,
greater
שגם כן
Israel
העלה פה,
vis-à-vis democracy, which was brought up
אני
here,
אגיד פה משהו שמישהו שאמר
let
את
me
זה,
say
לא
something
מצביע למפלגה שאני
that
מצביע.
somebody said it
דוקטור
doesn't
גדי טאוב אמר פעם, אני נורא
vote for the
רוצה
same
לסיים
party.
את
Gadi
הכיבוש.
Taub said, I really
יש רק
want to
בעיה
end
אחת שאני לא
occupation. There's
יכול.
only one reason.
משום שאין
One
לי מי
problem,
לדבר, זו
I
השאלה.
cannot because I
אם יש
have
עם מי
nobody
לדבר
to
או לא.
talk to.
יש הרבה
The
שרוצים לסיים
question
את
is
הכיבוש,
whether you want to
ועדיין
talk
יש
to
פה רוב
somebody or not. Many
שמוכן
people would like to
לבטל
end
כל מיני
occupation,
ויתורים.
but
אבל זה
others
לא עובד.
are ready
מה
to
לעשות?
make
כרגע אין עם
concession,
מי
but it
לדבר,
doesn't work. At the
וזו
moment,
הנקודה
there's nobody
המהותית.
to talk to.
ואני רוצה להגיד
That's
משהו
the main
לגבי
problem. And I want to say
התיקונים
something
שפרופסור סמוחה
regarding
הציע, ובזה אני אסיים.
the
לחזק את
remedies.
לחזק
First
את
of all,
הרכיב
to
היהודי,
strengthen
כמובן חלק
the
ביחס
Jewish
לערבים.
component
אבל אנחנו לא
because
יכול
that's
להיות
weak as opposed to the
דמוקרטים.
national
לא
or to the
יכולים להיות
democratic
מנותקים
ones.
מההקשר.
You cannot
בוא
be
ניתן למיעוט הערבי
detached
עכשיו
from
גם את
the
הזכויות
context.
הלאומיות,
Let's give now
מעמד
the
של מיעוט
Arabs all
לאומי,
their
אבל
national
צריך לראות את
rights,
ההקשר.
but you have to see the
נציגי
context.
המיעוט הערבי
The
לא אומרים
representatives
שהם
of
רוצים
the Arab
מעמד של
minority,
מיעוט
they don't
לאומי.
say that they
הם
want to
רוצים
have a
מדינת
status
כל
of
לאומיה,
national
וזה לא
minority.
יינתן
They
להם
want a
על
state
ידי
of all
הרוב
its
המכריע.
citizens.
ולכן
That's
להגיד,
not going to
רק בוא ניתן להם
be
וניתן. אני אתן להם
possible.
והם לא יחתמו
So
על זה.
if I give it to
כל
them and they're not
חוקה
going to sign
דמוקרטית
any
שהוצעה פה,
democratic
כל חוקה, כולל זו של
constitution
המכון לדמוקרטיה,
that was
בסוף
ever
הנציגים הערבים ברגע
offered
האחרון
here,
קמו
eventually
ואמרו,
the
אנחנו לא
Arab
יכולים לחתום.
representatives got up and said,
לא
we
בגלל
cannot
שהחוקה
sign,
דמוקרטית,
not
הלוואי
because we're
והחוקה הזאת
against
תתקבל.
democracy. Let's
אבל
hope that
כתוב
this
שם
content, but
בהתחלה
it says there
שמדינת
in the
לאום.
beginning,
לכן
this
אני אומר,
is a
יש פה
national,
איזשהו
a
הקשר,
nation
וצריך
state.
להסתכל עליו
So
כל
there's
הזמן.
a context. You always have to look at the context.
תודה. אז הנה, בבקשה, פרופסור סמוחה.
Professor Samocha, please, with your
מה
permission,
באמת, איך
what,
באמת
how
מיישבים,
exactly do
מרפאים
we
את המעגל,
uh,
כן משמרים את האופי, את
we preserve
היהודי,
the nature, the
את
Jewish nature, the
מדינת
Jewish
העם
character,
היהודי,
or
שרוב
the state of the
האוכלוסייה של
Jewish
הציבור היהודי
people,
לא רוצה
because the
לוותר על זה.
majority doesn't want to
אם
give it up.
באמת
with some sort of a recognition of this identity dilemma that the Arabs have. I think that I already answered this question. I said regarding the Jewish character of the state, you have to give up the exclusivity. The state belongs to the Arabs as well, not just to the Jewish people. It's no longer squaring the circle, because this is the truth. The homeland, the land of Israel is a joint land for Jews and Arabs. You have to recognize it. You have to build a mutual society. It doesn't stop Israel from being a Jewish and Zionist state. You have to strengthen democracy in order to balance between the Jewish character, Zionist character of the state. The problem in Israel is not a Jewish state. The problem in Israel is regarding the Arab minority. This is a Zionist state. So the difference between Jewish and Zionist state is that in the Jewish state there's a Jewish majority and all that, but a Zionist state is a state that its role is to perpetuate the Jewish character of the state and to prevent struggle on its Jewish character. These are two different things. The Arabs can accept a Jewish nation state, but they cannot accept a Zionist state. That's the great controversy. The Israeli society was established by the left. In the last 40 years, with the rise of the right, there's a huge struggle about the reshaping of the Israeli society in the spirit of the right. And that's what the struggle is all about. Also the struggle regarding Jewish and democratic state, as well as the conflict with the Palestinians, which is also regarding a Jewish state as well. These two things are connected to one another, because in order to continue to have a relationship of quiet, you have to create a national symmetry. And a national symmetry can be accepted only if there is a Palestinian state side by side with the state of Israel. Then the Israeli Arabs can feel that their national aspirations were answered. Because at the moment the Jews fulfilled themselves from a national point of view, but the Arabs didn't. So you have to try to solve. You can't solve. But to soften these contradictions between the Zionist state and the Jewish state, but the lack of a Palestinian state. That's the struggle today, and that's the struggle between right and left. It's a huge struggle. But the Arabs in Israel, as citizens, they have the right to participate in this struggle, and they do participate by strengthening the Israeli democracy. Thank you. Thank you very much. So actually what you're saying is that in order to preserve the Zionist and Jewish state, you need a Palestinian state that will enable the Arab minority to have some sort of national sense, and then it can live with the Jewish Zionist state, if I understood you correctly. But let's go on to Hagi. I want to put you into this discussion about values. We spoke about purity of arms and the attitude to the enemy. I want to talk also about the army of the people, of the religious, of the secular. Nevertheless, how do we square the circle here in the context of the tension between the wishes and requirements of the religion with their women's service in the IDF? It's a hot subject recently. Here as well, the values of equality and women's rights are strong enough, or maybe too strong, vis-à-vis the religion and the sensitivity of the religious population. How do we settle this? Okay, I'll relate with 4 points. First of all, as a citizen in the State of Israel, when we look at democracies in the world, democracy is not a religion. I keep hearing preserve democracy, but democracy at the moment leads in a few places in the world to extremism and to jeopardizing the state. I still think that it's the best, the least bad method, but I suggest not to take it as a religion. And we should investigate and find the right solutions to the phenomena that happen in democracy. The second comment, I think that most of the solutions of the borders are, that's it. We solved them. We made peace with Egypt. Today, it's accepted in the state of Israel. Remember what demonstrations were here when we returned Sinai Peninsula, and of course, it's not part of Israel. We had a peace agreement with Jordan. We annexed the Golan Heights. Sure, there were all sorts of controversies, but that were Lebanon. We withdrew from Lebanon, and we know what's happened. There's only one place where there's non-agreement, and for that, we're going to lose our state, whether we talk about the greater... So I have a suggestion. We can't hear him. Yeah, now we can. So I have an offer. I think we should solve the Palestinian issues, but leave it for a minute. It's going to be solved because it's obvious we're going to go towards the two-state solution. And let's deal now with the agreements, with the not to allow the radicals to dictate and to make a rapprochement of hearts, because I think that's more threatening on the state of Israel. The third comment relates to what was said about leaving values to politicians. I think that will be a disaster. There will be a politicization of the army. No, to give the responsibility to the politicians. That's what you said. To be involved in the values of the IDF, I think it's a disaster. And the IDF is going to lose its status as the army of the people. It will be go according to the government. And I think that's very dangerous. And the last thing is about the service of women in the army, and I think that Israel is coping altogether with equality of women, like the entire world. The state of Israel, the mere fact that it's a religious country in some of the groups of it is more challenged maybe. But together with that, I think that the direction and the trend is quite clear. We're going towards full equality for women. If you think that there's now equality, I don't think it's true. It doesn't happen all the time. Look at the labor market. Look what kind of populations work, who are the women. But the army definitely, first of all, wants to take the women as a role. They have to do their job as protecting the country. And the second thing, yes, some of the values of the army is the values of the state. Look at the scroll of independence, equality of rights. Does that clash in some places with the perceptions of some people? Yes, it does. And that's part of the challenge. I think the army gives a good solution. And the fact that as more and more religious girls are enlisted every year, although the rabbis are against it, they tell them not to be enlisted. It's not true, because many more roles in the army are open for women. And it's a fact that the IDF is coping with challenges vis-a-vis populations that find it difficult. Singing of women and women, being partners in all the different roles. Professor Friedman, from you I'd like to hear what is your opinion about the situation that the Supreme Court finds itself today. There's a certain feeling, arguments that that the Supreme Court has an elite kind of opinion. It tries to dictate policy. It doesn't like the policy of the government, so it tries to dictate another. And there's another sense that the Supreme Court became the issue that wants to weaken it in order to enable all sorts of activities against the Supreme Court, and because it tries to protect all these democratic values. Where do you think is the Supreme Court today, and is there a real fear? Is the criticism valuable? I still think that the Supreme Court expanded its authorities way beyond what's good for it and for the state. In other words, at that moment, when it overexpands its authority, it clashes too much with the political echelon, and it doesn't allow itself to protect human rights. It means that this is really the result from this great expansion. I divided it into periods. I think that in the first 35 years that the formal authorities of the Supreme Court were more limited, then its moral strength was much higher. And I'm afraid that it lost it. However, I also repeat things that I said. You have to understand that the strength of the Supreme Court, although formally it looks great, all in all, it's quite limited. Namely, the Supreme Court doesn't stop the central processes in the society. If process started of demolishing houses, then the Supreme Court every day decides to demolish this house or not. But the settlement enterprise, the whole thing actually worked without the Supreme Court stopping it or having any impact. It deals with it day and night, but it has no impact. It has limitations. Just one or two comments about the period where the left was in power. In that time, there was no representation to the Palestinian national movement in the Knesset. The representation arrived only with the right government. How did it happen? Everybody can think what was and how the Supreme Court had handled this. But until the 80s, they didn't have any representation. So that's something that's changed. And the last point regarding this discussion regarding the Palestinians, I think that in order to preserve democracy and human rights, it's necessary for us to separate from the Palestinians. This is something essential. And if you cannot reach it by agreement, you have to find another solution. The rights, democracy, and human rights are going to be jeopardized if this thing doesn't happen. I think this has to be clear, and this is something that we need in the Supreme Court to do it. They cannot do it by themselves. You cannot bring things to the Supreme Court that have to go to the government. The government has to solve this. It's not an issue that the Supreme Court will decide this or the other. That's not going to have an impact. And another comment regarding the borders and the threats. The borders are not agreed upon. Maybe it's agreed upon with Egypt. The Golan Heights is not agreed upon. It's we agree upon it, but the world doesn't. The fact that we agreed, it's all very nice, but we agreed on other things as well, but it's not agreed upon by the world. It's not. It's just hanging, and the North has problems of itself, we know. So this is it, basically. I hope that the issue of rights, and another comment regarding the Palestinians, when we talk about the, just last comment, when one day, I hope, there'll be a Palestinian state. We have to think whether it will have a Jewish minority or not, or we only will have the Arab minority, but they will not have a Jewish minority there. And this also has a significance.
יש לך דקה לסכם קצת איך עושים את זה? איך עוברים מהדיון קצוות לדיון הערכי של האמצע, של האיזון?
אי אפשר בדקה לפתור את זה, אבל אני אגיד משהו אופטימי לסיום, נכון? צריך לסיים באופטימיות. אז אני כן אגיד שאנחנו יודעים מכל המחקרים שאנחנו עושים, מכל העבודת שטח שאנחנו עושים, באמת עשרות אלפי שיחות שמתנהלות בתנועה שלי, הרוב הישראלי הוא מתון, ומשני צידי קו האמצע. והחלוקה הרבה פעמים שלנו למפלגות, מחלקים אותנו למצביעי כולנו ומצביעי ליכוד ומצביעי מחנץ ומצביעי חרדיות ומשותפת וכולי. הרבה פעמים זאת חלוקה מלאכותית, כי אם אתם בודקים את העמדות של הציבור, אתם מגלים שיש המון הסכמה בין הרבה מאוד חלקים בציבור. ולכן אני פונה לכל מי שמכם פעיל היום בזירה הציבורית, ככל שנדע לרתום ציבורים מכל השבטים ומכל הקבוצות ומכל המפלגות. ככל שנדע לייצר מאבקים גם פוליטיים שהם חוצי מפלגות, אפילו חוצי קואליציה ואופוזיציה, ולהפעיל את הרוב הזה שהיום הוא דומם ולא מאמין ביכולת שלו להשפיע על ישראל, ככל שנשכיל לעשות את זה, נחזק את הערכים הקונצנזואליים, ויש כאלה. ואני גם רוצה לומר מילה רק על העניין של הפלסטינים וכולי. אנחנו הרבה שנים דיברנו על שתי מדינות, כשראש הממשלה עדיין מכהן, דיבר על ניהול הסכסוך. היום הסיפור הוא לא בין ניהול הסכסוך לשתי מדינות. היום הסיפור הוא בין שתי מדינות, הוא היפרדות, כפי שאתה קורא לזה, לבין סיפוח של יהודה ושומרון. נגד סיפוח יהודה ושומרון יש רוב ברור במדינת ישראל. רוב הציבור מתנגד לסיפוח, ולכן הליכוד הצביע עכשיו בעד סיפוח יהודה ושומרון, אבל הרבה מאוד ממצביעיו, ממש עמוק לתוך מצביעי הליכוד, אתם רוצים מתנגדי סיפוח, ולכן היכולת לשבור פרדיגמות של שמאל-ימין בהקשר הזה, לשבור פרדיגמות מפלגתיות, ולכנס את הציבור שיכול להסכים על דברים ולהפעיל אותו למען מטרות משותפות, כמו למשל להדוף חזרה את רעיון הסיפוח למגירה שאליה הוא שייך, זה משהו שתפקידנו לעשות וניתן לעשות אותו. אז תודה רבה.
תודה רבה לכל הדוברים, לכל המגיבים, תודה לקהל, להמשך כנס מהנה.